Good evening, my holy sisters and brothers. That's the Moshav band doing their version of the priestly blessing. We actually say that every day. In the morning, we say a blessing that is good for the whole day, being the blessing on Torah study, right? So we say a blessing in the morning, Baruch atah Adonai, I'm just teaching it, so I'll say with God's name in it. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah, right? Who commands us with his, blessed you Lord our God, ruler of the universe, who sanctifies us with his commandments and commands us to immerse ourselves in words of Torah. And having said that blessing, we immediately want to study a piece of Torah. So in every Jewish prayer book, after we say that blessing in the morning, we read the priestly blessing. May the Lord bless you and keep you. May the Lord countenance you and be gracious to you. May the Lord favor you and grant you shalom. We also use that blessing to bless our children on Friday nights. But that's like just such a beautiful way that the Moshav band sing that blessing. I like it a lot and highly recommend. They have two albums, Volume 1 and Volume 2, songs of Shabbos. I mean, it's part of of Shabbos to do the priestly blessing as like every other day. And so they just have these wonderful melodies for all the prayers of Shabbos. That's Moshav Band Shabbos, Volume 1 and 2. How you guys doing? Let's light up the darkness. Who is with us as we do some beautiful learning on a Sunday night? Yehuda in South Carolina, Melissa in Great Neck, New York, James in Indianapolis, Tom Castarelis says shalom, Rebecca in Elai, Christo in Lubbock, Maria in Bellingham, Washington, Renee in Indiana, Paula in the Great Northwest, still feeling terrible. May you have a complete and speedy recovery, Paula, and we all say amen. Stephen in Dover, New Hampshire. Leah wishing everyone a good week. Shavua Tov from Fort Myers, Florida. Enrique in South Texas. Sharon in Lebanon, New Jersey. And over there on the YouTube side, Lynn in North Texas and Seraphim in Pine Grove and Gigi in British Columbia. Welcome, everybody. As you can tell from the title of today's show, we're going to be taking a little digression, a short digression from the laws of the Sukkah. Generally speaking, we're on page 18, Daf Yud Ches. We're still in chapter 1 of Tractate Sukkah. This is the 7th volume of the Talmud. We are studying the laws of Sukkot, and this first chapter of 5 is all about the requirements of the Sukkah itself. Remember that the definitive distinguishing feature, page 17. So coming here from a Baraisa. A Baraisa is contemporaneous with the Mishna. If one roofed the entire sukkah with cedar beams that have 4 handbreadths in their width, everyone agrees that the sukkah is unfit. So we've had this dispute before between Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda. If one puts boards on top of the sukkah, if the boards are more than 4 handbreadths wide or more, well, there was an argument about what if it's exactly 4 handbreadths. Definitely more than 4 handbreadths, it's going to render the sukkah unfit. I think Rabbi Yehuda says boards that are 4 handbreadths wide or less can be used in the roofing of the sukkah. Rabbi Meir says no, he doesn't like using boards up there. We really would prefer to have reeds or palm branches, something, leaves, branches with leaves, something in a much more natural and raw state. You could have beams up there to hold up the schach, hold up the roofing. But what if those beams are really wide, right? So that's what this discussion is about. But here the Baraisa is saying, well, what if the entire roof, the entire roof, what if one roofed the entire sukkah with cedar beams that have 4 handbreadths in their width? So everyone agrees that the sukkah is unfit. But if they do not have 4 handbreadths in their width, so if each of those beams is less than 4 handbreadths, so Rabbi Meir still deems the sukkah unfit. Rabbi Yehuda would say that it is fit. Rabbi Meir will concede that if there is between one board and another board a gap which is the complete width of a board, and then one places proper roofing from the waist of the threshing floor and the wine press, right? And it's from that verse that we derive what needs to be the roofing of a sukkah, like the waste material from the threshing floor, so that would be like stalks of wheat after the grain has been taken off of them, or the waste from the wine press, which would be like the vines and branches and leaves as opposed to the grapes, right? So it's really all the stuff that is not food, and that's why we derive that what is proper schach. It's something that is not susceptible to ritual impurity. It hasn't been fashioned into a vessel, and it grew from the ground. So here we're saying, well, what if it's just beams? So even Rabbi Meir would concede that if you have a lot of beams up there, but in between the beams, just as much space as the beams themselves occupy is where you have the proper roofing, the branches and leaves, etc., in between the beams, that this would be a proper sukkah. Now the Gemara clarifies. Granted, according to the one who said, both along the side and in the center, a sukkah is rendered unfit with a measure of 4 cubits of unfit roofing. It is due to the reason that the sukkah under discussion is fit, as none of the boards are actually 4 cubits wide. So there was an opinion that what's going to render the sukkah unfit, it's that if you have unfit roofing along the edge that's 4 cubits wide or more, that's more than 4 cubits wide. Why? Because if you have 4 cubits of unfit roofing adjacent to the wall of the sukkah, it's as if the wall curved over, and the sukkah really hasn't begun yet until you get to the proper roofing. So even 4 cubits is like 6 feet. So we can have unfit roofing, inappropriate roofing for a sukkah, but as long as it's adjacent to the wall and it's less than 6 feet, less than 4 cubits, the sukkah is still going to work. But if the unfit roofing extends more than 4 cubits away from the wall, it's not going to work. This sukkah is unfit. Now, there's also an opinion that would say that 4 cubit maximum of unfit roofing also applies to the unfit roofing in the middle of the sukkah. Now, that's an odd opinion. We've been used to the idea that unfit roofing, it's 4 handbreadths that would render the sukkah unfit, not 4 cubits, which is a much wider measure. However, according to the one who said that a sukkah is rendered unfit with a measure of 4 handbreadths of unfit roofing in the center, why is the sukkah fit? Each board is capable on its own of rendering the sukkah unfit. According to that opinion, if the boards are actually 4 handbreadths wide, each one of them renders the sukkah unfit. How can you have boards like that on the sukkah? Rav Huna, the son of Rabbi Yehoshua, said, here we are dealing with a sukkah that is exactly 8 cubits. And I've made a little figure here to help us understand this. So these numbers down here, all of them are 4s. And this corresponds to the width of each of these segments, right? So this is a board that's 4 handbreadths wide. And then, my scale is terrible, but just stay with me. And then this is proper roofing, like, just branches and twigs and leaves. Then another board, branches and leaves and twigs. Another board, then 4 and 4, right? A double section of proper roofing. Then a board, then proper schach, then a board, then proper schach, then another board. The idea of this explanation here in the Gemara, which says that this sukkah is 8 cubits long, and so this is based on the idea that each cubit is 6 handbreadths. So when you do half of the sukkah, right, that's 4 cubits. Each one is 6 handbreadths, so you have 24 handbreadths in each half of the sukkah. And so then they lay it out, board, schach, board, schach, board, schach, schach. And this is the key measure, because in the middle, you have a span of 8 handbreadths of schach, of proper roofing. The waste from the threshing floor or the wine press, palm branches, twigs, branches, leaves, etc., as opposed to a cut board. Because you've got this 8 handbreadths in the middle, this sukkah is going to be fit. If the array was a little different, where it just went board, skach, board, skach, board, skach, skach, all the way across, and you never had that span of 8 handbreadths, they would say that, at least according to this opinion, that sukkah is unfit. Abaye said, if there is a space measuring 3 handbreadths in a large sukkah, which is defined as one larger than 7 by 7 handbreadths, right? So we've made a distinction between sukkahs, something called a small sukkah. We might as well call it a tiny sukkah, which is just like the minimum size sukkah, and that's underneath the roofing. There's 7 by 7 handbreadths underneath the proper roofing. And anything more than that, even a huge sukkah, a royal sukkah, a magnificent sukkah, a synagogue sukkah, acres of sukkah, right? Anything bigger than the tiny sukkah is being called a large sukkah or a regular sukkah. But if we were talking about the minimum size sukkah, then things change because there's so little wiggle room to still have what you need. So Abaye said, if there is a space means that there's nothing in the roof, a gap in the roofing where it's just, air going right up to the sky. Abaye said, if there is a space in the roofing that's 3 handbreadths, in a large sukkah, which is defined as a sukkah that's larger than 7 by 7 handbreadths, and one diminished the space, right? Because if you have a space of 3 handbreadths, we've already learned that that's going to invalidate the sukkah, it'll render it unfit. But if you take that 3 handbreadth gap and you diminish it somehow, well, now the sukkah should be fit, because now there's not a gap of 3 handbreadths. However, the manner of diminishing matters. So if one diminished the space, according to Abaye, whether he did so with branches, meaning the type of material that is fit for roofing a sukkah, or whether he did it with metal skewers or metal rods, which is unfit material, it is still an effective diminution, as there is neither sufficient space nor sufficient unfit roofing to render the sukkah unfit. So if you have a gap of 3 handbreadths, ideally you put proper schach to fill that gap, and now it's a good sukkah. But even if you filled it with unfit material, like metal rods, the sukkah would still work, because we saw that for unfit roofing to invalidate the sukkah, you need a measure of 4 handbreadths. And this would only be you filled in the gap, which was 3 handbreadths. So it would work no matter what you filled it with, because the key is you don't have an empty space anymore. You don't have an empty gap anymore. However, in a small sukkah, right, the tiny sukkah that's only 7 by 7 handbreadths, if one diminished that and you had that 3 handbreadth gap in the middle, definitely makes the sukkah unfit. Now, if you diminish it with branches, it's an effective diminution, and now the sukkah is valid. But if you diminish that gap, if you filled in the gap with metal rods, now the sukkah remains unfit. Because if it's 7 by 7 handbreadths and 3 of those 7 are unfit roofing, do we have enough fit roofing for this sukkah to be a sukkah? And the answer is no, because you need 7. You need 7 handbreadths for it to be a fit sukkah. And the Gemara notes, and this applies only if the space is along the side of the sukkah, in which case the principle of lavud applies. However, if the space is in the center of the sukkah, Rav Acha and Ravina disagree with regard to the ruling, right? So there's a difference if that gap, that empty gap, is at the edge of the sukkah, where you could argue that if it's less than 3 handbreadths, that gap, it's actually as if there's no gap at all, because it gets closed off. But if it's in the middle, maybe that doesn't work. Does lavud, does this principle that things are within 3 handbreadths of each other are considered to be joined, is that going to work in the middle of the sukkah? We know it works at the edge of the sukkah. Rav Acha and Ravina disagree with regard to the ruling. One of them said the principle of lavud, joining together things that are less than 3 handbreadths apart, is applied even in the center of the sukkah. And the other one said the principle of lavud is not applied in the center of the sukkah. Even if one diminished the space, the 2 sides of the roofing are not considered joined. And the Gemara explains, what is the rationale for the opinion of the one who said that the principle of lavud is applied even in the center of the sukkah? It is, as is taught in the Tosefta, which is almost contemporaneous with the Mishna, kind of the first layer of commentary on the Mishna by the rabbis of the Mishna themselves. With regard to a cross beam of the merging of alleyways that projects from this wall of an alleyway but does not reach the opposite wall. Okay, so let's make a quick figure of that. So what they're talking about here is, we saw in Tractate Eruvin, so the structures that the rabbis created to enable us to carry on Shabbos, right? So like in our neighborhood, we have Elai has the biggest Eruv in the world, I believe. This massive structure. It's actually made with wires and phone poles and stuff, but it allows us to make like one large private domain within the bounds of the Eruv, so we can carry, for instance, a talis bag, or walk a stroller, or carry a baby from one house to another within the Eruv on Shabbos. It's a big convenience. Not everybody holds by the Eruv. So one of the rules that we learned about joining private domains so that people can carry, in the absence of like a whole neighborhood Eruv, kind of a smaller scale joining of courtyards, right, is when we had the concept of an alleyway, right? I put 2 doorways here. So imagine, right, this is a dead end. Okay, this is an alleyway, and this is a dead end, and there's a courtyard here. Maybe it'd be more accurate to do like this, right? There's a courtyard here with a couple of houses in it, and a courtyard here with a couple of houses in it. And the people want to carry, they want to visit their neighbors who live in the courtyard across the alley on Shabbos. Can they bring some stuff over for lunch from their courtyard to this other courtyard? And the rabbis said, you're not going to be able to do that according to rabbinic law unless you make an adjustment to this alleyway. Either you put a side post right here at the entrance, so it's like as if this whole thing is a private domain that has a kind of an entryway, like a door, or you do cross beam. Okay, but now, so this is an overhead view, and imagine there's a cross beam over this alley, right? At the entrance of the alley, there's a cross beam above your head when you walk under it when you enter the alley. That would make a perfect correction, and then they could carry from one side of the alley to the other. What if that cross beam had a gap in it, right? So the cross beam that was over the entrance when you walk into the alley, what if it's actually a beam that extends from each end, but they don't come together in the middle? Let's say they do come within 3 handbreadths of each other. Does the principle of lavud apply that since they come within 3 handbreadths of each other, it's as if they connect, and therefore the alley has been adjusted and we can do the carrying on Shabbos that we would like to do? That's the issue being presented. So, the principle of lavud is applied, is the principle of lavud applied in the center of a sukkah? It is as taught in the Tosefta with regard to a cross beam for the merging of alleyways that projects from this wall of an alleyway but does not touch the other beam projecting from the opposite wall. And similarly, with regard to 2 cross beams, one projecting from this wall and one projecting from the other wall, and they do not touch each other. So one is like the beam goes all the way across the alley but doesn't quite make it to the other wall. And the second case is that there's 2 beams, one coming from each side, and they don't quite meet in the middle. If there is a gap of less than 3 handbreadths between the beam and the wall, or between the 2 beams respectively, one need not bring another crossbeam to render the alleyway fit for one to carry within it on Shabbos, as they are considered joined based on the principle of lavud. However, if there is a gap of 3 handbreadths or more, one must bring another crossbeam. Therefore, from that teaching in Tractate Eruvin, we learn that a gap in the middle of less than 3 handbreadths, we do apply the principle of lavud to it. So therefore, it should be that if we have a gap in the middle of the sukkah of less than 3 handbreadths, we should just use the principle of lavud, and it says if the whole sukkah ceiling is complete, there is no gap. And the Gemara asks, and the other sage who holds that lavud, and by the way, that gap could run like the whole width of the sukkah, right? It's like as if the schach comes all the way to the center, and let's say there's a strip that's just 2 handbreadths wide down the whole width of the sukkah, and the schach of one side never touches the schach of the other side. So the total area of that gap is a lot more, than 3 by 3 handbreadths. It could be quite long. It could be like 10 handbreadths or 20 handbreadths, but only 2 handbreadths wide. So do we count as if the 2 sides touch each other because they're less than 3 handbreadths apart? Right? That's what we're arguing about. And so the Gemara asks, so it seems like if we apply the principle from the Eruv and the 2 cross beams that don't quite meet in the center, but they do render that alleyway adjusted so we can carry there on Shabbos, it would seem like we apply that principle to the sukkah. The sukkah would be a valid sukkah despite this strip of empty space in the middle. The Gemara asks, and the other sage who holds that lavud does not apply in the center of the sukkah, how would he explain this Tosefta from Tractate Eruvin? And the Gemara clarifies that sage would say that the crossbeams over the entryway of an alley are different, because the prohibition against carrying in an alleyway on Shabbos is a decree by rabbinic law. And therefore it is a rabbinic ordinance that beams may be placed at the entrance of the alleyway to permit carrying therein. And therefore the sages were lenient. In other words, that alleyway really is a private domain, and by Torah law, you can carry there on Shabbos. The sages decreed that you cannot carry there on Shabbos because people will come to make a mistake, and if they can just carry in that alleyway without some kind of reminder or adjustment, they'll think that they can carry when they reach the street as well, and then they'll come to violate Shabbos. So the rabbis decree that you can't carry in that alleyway on Shabbos unless you put that crossbeam. So since the crossbeam is a fix instituted by the rabbis to solve the problem created by the rabbinic decree, or to solve the restriction created by a rabbinic decree, they're going to be more lenient and allow lavud to function in the middle of the crossbeam, just as they would allow it to function at the edge where one crossbeam doesn't reach the other wall. But from the fact that they're lenient in this case of a rabbinic decree, maybe we can't learn that they would also be lenient with respect to a sukkah whose requirements are not by rabbinic decree but by Torah law. What is the reason for the opinion of the one who said the principle of lavud does not apply in the center? Right? Where does he get that? Okay, so we're not going to rely on a leniency, but where does he actually derive that the lavud will not work when the gap is in the center? He's going to look at another body of law. He's going to look at this idea of tuma of the corpse, or tuma of the tent. In other words, corpse tuma inside a house. And the idea here is, this is a law in the Torah, that if a human being dies indoors, right? So if there's a human corpse indoors, then every person who shares the indoors with that corpse is going to become tameh, is going to be ritually impure, and they're going to remain ritually impure, even though they didn't touch the corpse, but because they're under the same roof with the corpse. The example is given of a tent in the Torah, but it's going to be extended to just being indoors with a corpse. Nowadays, there's nothing we can do about it because we don't have the red heifer, which would be, the ashes of the red heifer would be necessary for a purification from corpse tuma, from the ritual impurity. And it doesn't matter because we can't enter the temple anyway, which is why the laws of purity really are important. That if you are tameh, you have to be purified before you enter the temple. when the Messiah comes and the third temple is rebuilt, a red heifer will probably also be sent so that we can go through purification in case we do that beautiful work of attending to the dead, burying a body, etc. Okay, so with respect to that body of law, the Gemara is going to point out that if there's a skylight, if there's an opening in the roof, right, and the corpse is under that opening or the person is under that opening, so that's going to change whether you contract that tumah from the corpse that's in the same room with you. So what is the reason of the one who said the principle of lavud does not apply in the center of the sukkah? It is as we learned in the Mishna. In the case of a skylight in the roof of a house whose opening is 1 square handbreadth, so it's just very small, just 1 handbreadth by 1 handbreadth. If there is a source of ritual impurity imparted by a corpse inside the house, all the objects in the entire house become ritually impure, as the legal status of the roof is that of a tent over a corpse. However, the objects that are directly underneath the skylight remain tahor, ritually pure, because the roof doesn't cover that part of the house. So they do not share a roof with the corpse. They're not under the same roof as the corpse because they're under the skylight. So they're under the sky and not under the roof, as the roof does not cover that part of the house. If the source of ritual impurity is itself right underneath the skylight, all the objects in the entire house remain tahor, ritually pure, as there is no roof over the source of the impurity, meaning the corpse. If the skylight does not have an opening of a square handbreadth and there is ritual impurity in the house, the objects opposite the skylight, underneath the skylight, remain ritually pure. If the source of ritual impurity is aligned with the skylight, is underneath the skylight, the objects in the entire house are ritually pure. Apparently, the principle of lavud is not applied in the center. If it were, because we've been talking about a skylight that's only 1 handbreadth by 1 handbreadth, it's less than 3 handbreadths across. So if we applied lavud, it should be that it doesn't matter whether the skylight is there or not. It's as if the ceiling were closed, and no matter, as long as that skylight is less than 3 handbreadths wide, it should be like the skylight doesn't exist. The roof is joined on either side of it, and anybody that's inside that house with the corpse is going to become tameh. So the one who's saying that lavud doesn't apply in the center of the sukkah seems to have a very good argument. And the Gemara asks, and the other sage who holds that lavud applies in the center, how would he answer this sage? How would he answer the claim of this Mishnah? And the Gemara answers, the laws of ritual impurity of Tumah and Tahara are different, as that is the way that we learn, that the sages learned them through tradition. The halachas, the laws of tents and ritual impurity, are halachas transmitted to Moses from Sinai, Lemoshe Misinai, right? So this idea of the 1 handbreadth measurement and whether, and that the skylight will, does not, if the body is under the skylight, everybody else remains pure. If it's not under the skylight, but a person is under the skylight, he remains pure, etc. All these laws have their origin in the oral tradition at Mount Sinai, and we actually can't derive other laws about measurements and 3 handbreadths versus 1 handbreadth, opening in the middle, etc., to extend that teaching to the sukkah, because the laws of corpse tumah in a tent are very particular, and the core of those teachings was transmitted orally to Moses at Sinai and passed down teacher to student, Moses to Joshua, Joshua to the elders to the judges to the prophets to the men of the great assembly, the men of the great assembly to the rabbis, etc. And so it's a very specific body of law, and we can't take that principle and extend it to the sukkah. And that's where they leave the argument. Rabbi Yehuda bar Elai taught a house that was breached, meaning there's a hole in the ceiling in the middle of the house and one roofed over it with proper materials for a sukkah, is a fit sukkah. And Rabbi Yishmael, the son of Rabbi Yosei, said to him, my teacher, explain your opinion. That's it. All he said was, if there's a house and there's a hole in the roof in the middle of the roof, and then you put schach there, proper roofing, it's a fit sukkah with no other qualifications or limitations. So Rabbi Yishmael, the son of Rabbi Yosei, said to him, my teacher, explain your opinion. So Rabbi Yehuda bar Elai said, this is how my father explained it. If the ceiling between the wall and the breach is 4 cubits long, the sukkah is unfit. If it is less than 4 cubits, the sukkah is fit. So we've already learned that. So he's saying that if the distance between the hole in the middle of that ceiling in the house and the wall of the house is less than 4 cubits, this is going to work as a sukkah because that is a curved wall, and then the sukkah actually begins where the proper roofing is, the proper schach that you use to fill in the hole that was in the ceiling, the breach that was in the ceiling. The point here is that he taught it without that explanation at first, and Rabbi Yishmael, the son of Rabbi Yosei, had to ask for, like, what do you mean? And then he said, well, my father said, right, as long as it's more than, that the ceiling still attached to the wall is less than 4 cubits wide. He felt like that didn't need to be said because there's a note here that a standard house is 8 cubits. And so if it's breached in such a way that there's going to be enough schach to be a proper sukkah, then for sure the wall is going to be less than 4 cubits, and so this whole thing would work. Now we're going to get to another teaching that Rabbi Yehuda bar Elai taught that he got from his father. He said, with regard to the avroma, it is permitted to eat it. This is a type of fish, despite the fact that it is a very small fish that is typically caught in a net with many similar non-kosher fish, and it is difficult to distinguish between them. So Rabbi Yishmael, the son of Rabbi Yosei, said to him, my teacher, explain your opinion. And Rabbi Yehuda bar Elai said, this is how my father explained it. The avroma is found in the rivers of this place so-and-so, like they didn't actually name the place, but it's some place so-and-so, where there are also non-kosher fish, and that one is prohibited. However, the avroma of a different place so-and-so, where there are no non-kosher fish to get caught in the same net, it is permitted. Right? So the only reason we're now talking about non-kosher fish is because this was an exchange between Rabbi Yehuda bar Elai and Rabbi Yishmael, the son of Rabbi Yosei. And in both cases, he made like a categorical statement that seemed like a little bit too much overreaching. And then Rabbi Yishmael asked him to explain. He said, this is how I learned it from my father, and then gave a little bit more knowledge. Now that we're talking about non-kosher fish, so basically what the Torah says is that we can eat fish from the sea, creatures from the sea, if they are fish with fins and scales. Any other creature from the sea, not kosher. Right? So it has to be fish with fins and scales. There certainly are fish with fins, but not scales, like sharks and catfish. Those are not kosher fish. Are there fish that have scales, but not fins? Sort of, maybe, not really. The vast, basically, if it has scales, it also has fins. If there's a creature that has that has scales, but not fins, so it's not a fish. There might be such a sea creature, but it's not a fish, and therefore it's not kosher. And this is how Rabbi Abraham Fox explains how the author of the Shulchan Aruch explains the problem that they found, some sea creatures that have scales but not fins. After the Talmud said elsewhere that basically if it has scales, it also has fins. But then they found something that has scales and no fins. But it's okay because it's not a fish. So what the Torah says is, and this is forever, that you can eat it if it's a fish with scales and fins. And then the Talmud adds, if it's a fish and it has scales, it also has fins. So you don't have to worry too much once you identify something that looks like a fish and has scales. However, fish with fins that don't have scales, there's quite a few. Now, the vast majority of fish are kosher. Most fish have both fins and scales. I mean, you're talking obviously salmon. Jews eat a lot of salmon, and tuna, and tilapia, and tench. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. Squawfish, sprat, spot, spearing, sole, sockeye salmon, snooks, sleeper. I mean, there's just tons of kosher fish. Pike, pigfish, pickerel, permit. Just scanning around, grindle, grouper, grunion, grunts, goldeye and mooneye, gobies, goatfishes, surmulets. And you can just find a list pretty easily. If you Google non-kosher fish, you can find the first offering is from kashrut.com, and it has this whole list of kosher fish. But what I think is interesting is which are the non-kosher fish. So here are some non-kosher fish, some of which you've heard of. They're not so rare. Angler, not kosher. Basa, beluga, billfishes, blowfish, bullhead, burbot, cabezon, catfish, very famous, well-known non-kosher fish. Dogfish, eels. Right, so when I first became an observant Jew, I used to really love sushi. I used to love eating unagi. And I was actually reading that Torah portion that day. That one is actually specifically carved out. Not only is it not it's not a fish, and it doesn't have scales or it doesn't have fins rather. I'm sorry. I guess maybe I don't even know if eels have fins. At any rate, the Torah actually specifically mentions eels, that they are not kosher, right? So no eel, no unagi. Other non-kosher fish: freshwater cod, goosefish, grayfish, hoki, lamprey, lawyer, leather jacket, monkfish, ocean pout, paddlefish, puffer, blowfish, swellfish, sea squab, ratfish, rock prickleback, right? So you can look up these lists. Triggerfishes, tra. Now, there's also other issues that even if you have a kosher fish, not everyone will eat it because there has to be kind of provenance, that it wasn't, touched by something that was non-kosher. Like, for instance, if it came from a market where the people there might have used the same fish or the same knife or the same cutting board to handle shrimp and then to handle a kosher fish, well, they would have rendered the kosher fish unkosher for eating. But at any rate, there's a bit of a list for you. And now I'm almost done, so if you have questions or comments, get them in there. But since Rabbi Yehuda bar Elai was talking with Rabbi Yishmael, the son of Rabbi Yosef, so he said there's this small fish that it actually is kosher, but it's very small, and it's often found with non-kosher fish. So if you're fishing for it or trapping it, like casting your net in a place where it's going to get mixed up with non-kosher fish, so then you can eat it. But if you're taking it from a locality where it gets found with kosher fish only, then you can eat it, right? And so that was definitely a case-by-case specific thing. The Gemara notes that this is similar to that which Abaye said. These small fish, tzachanta, of the Bav River are permitted. And the Gemara asks, what is the reason that Abaye unequivocally permitted eating these fish and was not concerned about the potential presence of non-kosher fish among them? If we say that it is due to the fact that the water flows rapidly, and these non-kosher fish, since they do not have a spinal cord, are not able to exist in that water, as the current carries the non-kosher fish out of the Bav River, and consequently all the remaining fish are kosher, well, that is not the case. For don't we see that non-kosher fish do exist in rivers with strong currents? Rather, perhaps Abaye permitted it because the water is salty, and these non-kosher fish are not able to exist in that water because they do not have scales. But this too is not the case, as don't we see that non-kosher fish exist in salty water? Rather, Abaye permitted the small fish in the Bav River because the mud in that river is not suited for non-kosher fish to reproduce. The conditions in the river render it an unproductive habitat for non-kosher fish. So there's really only kosher fish in that area, and you don't have to be worried that when you cast your net and catch like thousands of these little fish, that other non-kosher fish will be mixed up with them, because at that locality, there aren't non-kosher fish that get mixed up when you cast the net. And Ravina said, and today, since the government built canals between the rivers, and the Eitan River and the Gamda River spill into the Bav, it is prohibited to eat the small fish without a thorough inspection, right? So that's just one of those cases where you have to be very specific and look at the locality, look at the case, look what's being done, look how it's being done. And that's why kashrut organizations like the Orthodox Union, so like if you look on a can of Coca-Cola, I'm pretty sure that's certified by the OU, so you would find like a circle with a U in it, right? And that means, and there's other kashrut supervision authorities. There's KSA and K and Star K, and there's a few different organizations that do this. But the Orthodox Union is probably the biggest and most famous. And what that means is that they send a rabbi who's an absolute expert in the laws of kashrus, and they look at the manufacturing facility and all the conditions and all the apparatus and all the engineering and everything that they do to make sure that no mistake is going to be made and end up introducing some non-kosher food into food that is certified kosher. And we've met a couple of those rabbis, and it's fascinating. It's absolutely fascinating work, what they do, checking out sort of large-scale food manufacturing and keeping it kosher, and how they make sure that it's done correctly. All right, let's go to comments and questions. Sharon Frant Brooks, wouldn't the validity of the roof with the opening in the middle be contingent in part on the total surface of the opening relative to the total surface of acceptable schach, i.e. amount of shade relative to light? Well, I think what we're going to require, we had a lot of conflicting rules, right? And that's like, and by the way, these questions usually don't come up because most, if you're going to bother to build a sukkah, you're going to be like completely in the legit zone. Like you're not going to be anywhere near these border areas, these boundary areas. But it seems like what you need is at least 7 handbreadths of fit sukkah in the middle. Now, that 7 handbreadths has to allow more shade, has to have more shade than sunlight. But I don't think we're distinguishing between the actual shade and sunlight in terms of area. We just need 7 handbreadths of fit schach in the middle for it to work. Christo, since I've not only attended but also officiated numerous funerals, it's a guarantee that I'm ritually impure for now. And the assumption is we're all ritually impure, right? There hasn't been a red heifer, for thousands of years. So, and we don't know where all the bodies are buried, and there's been, there were wars and battles and fields and people that weren't careful and they just buried bodies, and we've walked over it, and we've been through cemeteries and we've walked over. So even if we haven't literally touched a corpse, it's assumed that we've all walked over a corpse, and therefore we're tameh and we've never become tahor, right? Like women go to the mikveh once a month to become tahor, from their menses, and we still do that. And a convert goes to the mikveh to sort of symbolize, entering the Jewish people by immersing in the living waters of the mikveh. But nobody is able to become purified from corpse tumah because we don't have the ashes of the red heifer mixed with water that could be applied to us with the hyssop branch, etc. And finally, Seraphim Winslow, I assume that any caviar from non-kosher fish is non-kosher. That is my understanding. I've looked this up once. I haven't looked it up lately. You could definitely Google the question. So I'm not answering categorically, you're right, but my memory, if memory serves, that's correct, right? So non-kosher fish, you can't eat any part of it, including its eggs, right? Which is what the caviar is. Okay, that's what I've got for today. With God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow night at the regular time, 6 p.m. Pacific, for page 19 of Tractate Sukkah. Have a terrific night.